For a well-known middle-aged couple from Huntsville, Alabama, the Memorial Day weekend of 1992 was meant to rekindle their romance after the demands of daily life had kept them apart for far too long. They had no idea that tragedy was just around the corner. At first glance, the case seemed straightforward, a robbery gone horribly wrong. However, an unexpected tip turned the investigation toward two unlikely suspects. But was the final verdict as clear-cut as it seemed, or was justice left undone? Regardless of how Dr. Wilson was killed, the real question remained: who didn't commit the crime? Jack Wilson was born on May 5, 1937, in Chicago, Illinois. Little is known about his early life before he moved to Huntsville, Alabama. He had been married and divorced, with 3 children from his first wife. After the end of that marriage, Jack sought a fresh start and relocated to Huntsville. While establishing his ophthalmology practice, Dr. Wilson also worked as a consultant and performed eye surgeries at a local hospital. Friends, employees, and patients often described him as a kind man with a sharp sense of humor. Jack quickly became a beloved figure in the community, known not only as a gentleman but also as a compassionate doctor. In many cases, he treated patients free of charge if they couldn't afford his medical fees. Love returned to Jack's life when he met his second wife, Betty Woods. She worked as a nurse at the same hospital where Jack was employed. The two grew close while attending to a patient during the same shift. Their whirlwind romance led to Jack proposing, and Betty happily accepted. They married in 1978 and, despite their busy schedules, managed to make their marriage work. Those who knew them saw a deeply devoted couple. Jack often spoiled Betty with expensive gifts and trips, while Betty showered him with love and attention. Together, they lived in a grand brick mansion in an upscale neighborhood. For the next 14 years, they shared a mostly peaceful relationship. However, there were occasional arguments, often over Betty's drinking problems and Jack's demanding work schedule. Adding to their personal troubles was Jack's advanced Crohn's disease, which severely impacted his digestive system and required him to use a colostomy bag, causing strain on their intimate life. But Jack was determined to make things work. With Memorial Day weekend in 1992 approaching, he planned a romantic getaway to Santa Fe, New Mexico, just for the two of them. Sadly, his plans never materialized. On Friday afternoon, May 22, 1992, Jack left his office at 4 p.m. and returned home to prepare for their trip. The following morning, neighbors saw him outside, placing a political campaign sign in his yard with a metal baseball bat around 4:30 p.m. That was the last time anyone saw Jack alive. At 9:30 p.m. on that same Friday, Betty returned to the house she shared with Jack after attending an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting. She called out for him as she entered, but there was no answer. Betty headed upstairs to start packing for their trip the next day, only to find Jack lying unconscious and covered in blood in the hallway outside their bedroom door. Terrified, she fled the house, fearing the intruder might still be inside. She ran to a neighbor's house and asked them to call 911. Officers arrived within minutes, but it quickly became apparent this was no ordinary break-in. It was a murder. Near Jack's body, they found what appeared to be the weapon, a metal baseball bat. Police brought in sniffer dogs to search for evidence that might have been missed. They discovered a cut phone line in the bedroom and a ski mask lying on the bed. An open gun case with ammunition, but no firearm was found, along with Jack's wallet, which was empty of cash, but his credit cards remained. A sweep of the house revealed that the intruder had not ransacked other rooms. The mess was largely confined to the bedroom, raising doubts that this was a simple robbery gone wrong. Stranger still, no fingerprints were found on the murder weapon or anywhere else in the house. Betty, understandably, was too shaken to be interviewed immediately. Instead, investigators turned to the neighbors, asking if anyone had noticed anything unusual that day. However, no one recalled seeing or hearing anything out of the ordinary. Neighbors were also adamant that Jack had no known enemies. He was well loved in the community for his generous nature. Eventually, Betty calmed down enough to speak with investigators. She shared details about her day, mentioning that she had met Jack for lunch before they went their separate ways. Jack returned to his office while she ran some last-minute errands. Later, she attended her meeting and came home to find him unconscious. Her account was backed up by receipts from her shopping and witnesses from the meeting. The state medical examiner performed the autopsy and found multiple lacerations to Jack's head, along with a fractured skull. His hyoid bone was broken, indicating strangulation, and he had fractures to his right shoulder and neck, along with stab wounds in his abdomen. His arms were also broken, suggesting he had tried to defend himself. The official cause of death was blunt force trauma to the head and upper body. Although the metal bat was believed to be the murder weapon, it was not immediately handed over for forensic analysis. However, blood found on the bat was later confirmed to match Jack Wilson's blood type. Despite these findings, the case hit a dead end until a woman called the police, claiming she overheard a man talking about being hired to kill a doctor from Huntsville. The man she named was James White. Though the tip was met with skepticism, it was the first real lead in the case, prompting the police to investigate further. Investigators traveled to Vincent, Alabama, where 42-year-old James White lived in a mobile home on the outskirts of town. Since his divorce, James had been working part-time as a maintenance man at Vincent Elementary School. A background check revealed a troubled past. James had been dishonorably discharged while serving in Vietnam and had turned to alcohol and drugs to cope with the trauma. He had been in and out of prison and mental institutions and had been diagnosed with delusional behavior. James had also been involved in a prison escape and a suspected kidnapping. When questioned about his involvement in the case, James, like many criminals, initially gave investigators the runaround. He told half-truths, made contradictory statements, and denied everything at the start of the interview process. However, after 10 hours of interrogation, as dawn broke on a new day, James finally cracked and admitted to being at the Wilsons' home on the night of the murder. He was promptly arrested and charged with the murder of Jack Wilson. A search warrant was issued for James's property. In his mobile home, police found a pair of shoes with bloodstains, and in an abandoned house nearby, they discovered a weapon. In his truck, they found a book of poetry. While in custody, James began sharing several stories, the most significant involving a woman named Peggy, a first-grade teacher at Vincent Elementary School. James claimed he had done some carpentry work for Peggy, who supposedly developed feelings for him and started confiding in him about her unhappiness in her marriage. According to James, Peggy had once floated the idea of killing her husband but later backed out. However, she then asked James if he could help her sister hire someone to kill her sister's husband instead. James claimed he told Peggy he knew someone who could do the job for $20,000, but Peggy responded that it was too much since her sister wasn't in a good financial situation. They eventually settled on $5,000, half to be paid up front and the rest after the job was done. Though James's stories weren't entirely reliable, investigators followed up on the name he provided and soon uncovered a surprising connection between the woman named Peggy and the victim, Dr. Jack Wilson. The name sounded familiar to the investigators, but they couldn't immediately place it. As they reviewed their notes on the Wilson case, they made a shocking discovery. Peggy was the twin sister of Jack's wife, Betty Wilson. This revelation gave investigators more reason to dig deeper into James's story. The evidence collected during the search of James's property further supported this connection. The blood on James's shoes matched Jack Wilson's blood type. The weapon found was registered in Betty Wilson's name, and the book found in James's truck had been borrowed from Betty. With these findings, the investigators began to focus on the sisters, Betty and Peggy. Betty and Peggy were born on July 14, 1945. As fraternal twins, they had two older sisters and a challenging childhood, with their father often venting his frustrations on the family, both emotionally and physically. As they grew older and became teenagers, their differences in personality became more apparent. Peggy was a social butterfly with strong values and was even crowned homecoming queen. Betty, on the other hand, was rebellious, challenging authority and disregarding her parents' rules. She preferred the company of boys and wild parties. Both sisters married right after high school, had children, and eventually divorced. Peggy moved to Vincent, where she met and married a church deacon, dedicating her life to family and the church. In contrast, Betty moved to Huntsville, where she continued her party lifestyle. She enrolled in the nursing program at the University of Alabama, specializing in kidney dialysis. In 1976, she met Dr. Jack Wilson while working as a nurse, and they eventually married. Those close to the couple noticed that Betty thrived on the lifestyle Jack's wealth provided, enjoying the financial benefits that came with it. However, her relationship with her husband was more complicated. Cracks began to show as Jack became overwhelmed with work, spending long hours at the office and away from his new wife. Betty grew bored with his absence and turned to alcohol as a coping mechanism for her loneliness. She often partied late into the night, coming home intoxicated and ready to argue with Jack. Additionally, Jack's illness had become a strain on their relationship. Due to his colostomy, Jack could no longer maintain an intimate relationship with Betty, which led to a breakdown in their physical connection. According to a former housemate, Shirley Green, there was an incident where Jack's colostomy bag came loose during intercourse, causing a mess in the room. This led Betty to lose her temper with Jack. Afterward, she insisted they sleep in separate bedrooms and lead separate lives. Green also testified that Betty openly had affairs, often bringing lovers into the house while Jack was at work. Reports suggested that Betty eventually suffered from a pancreas-related illness and attempted to improve her behavior by joining Alcoholics Anonymous. However, she continued her affairs due to Jack's frequent absences, a fact she admitted to investigators during interviews. Despite their struggles, both Jack and Betty, having endured failed marriages before, were determined not to go through another divorce. Instead, they agreed to give their marriage another shot. It became increasingly clear to investigators that their attempts at reconciliation were merely a facade. The circumstantial evidence against Betty was overwhelming, leading to the arrest of Betty Wilson and Peggy on May 27, 1992, both charged with conspiracy to commit murder. Although investigators and prosecutors had their suspects in custody, they still needed to build a solid case to convict Betty and Peggy. Reviewing all the information gathered during the investigation, they theorized that Betty was motivated by greed. Interviews with those connected to the case suggested that Betty loved the lifestyle Jack's wealth provided but didn't love Jack himself. He had become a burden. Betty remained in custody awaiting trial, while Peggy, with the help of friends, was able to post the $150,000 bail and awaited her court date at her home in Vincent, Alabama. Much of the prosecution's case hinged on the testimony of James White. The district attorney agreed to offer James a plea deal in exchange for his honest testimony at the sisters' trial. The deal allowed James to plead guilty to simple murder instead of capital murder, but with a life sentence without the possibility of parole. James's appointed defense attorney negotiated a plea agreement for James White, reducing the charge to one with the possibility of parole after 7 years or less. James accepted the deal, avoiding the death penalty. After months of interrogation, James finally agreed to testify against Peggy and Betty, providing a more detailed and consistent account of the events. His confession was recorded by the prosecution, where he explained how Peggy came to trust him over time and introduced him to her sister, Betty. His confession also linked the poetry book to the case, detailing how Betty handed him the book containing the agreed-upon money. Betty Wilson's trial began on March 2, 1993. During the trial, James White's repeated confessions and the evidence found at his property were presented in court. Although no forensic evidence was found in Betty's car to corroborate James's claims, the trial proceeded based on the totality of the investigative findings. The prosecution focused heavily on Betty's character, portraying her as a manipulative woman driven by greed and dissatisfaction. Witnesses testified about Betty's numerous affairs and her volatile relationship with Jack, highlighting that her motivation for the murder was to inherit Jack's wealth. Betty's former housemate testified that Betty often ridiculed Jack and openly had affairs in their home. Marianne Lowe, who attended AA meetings with Betty, testified that she ended her friendship with her after discovering that Betty had used her as an alibi for her affairs. Harold Fitzpatrick, a man with whom Betty had an affair after meeting at an AA meeting, also took the stand. He testified about their relationship, which continued in Betty's home, even up until May 1992, just before the murder. The defense argued that bringing Fitzpatrick to the stand was a strategy to tarnish Betty's reputation before the jury. They insinuated racial undertones, as Fitzpatrick was African American, which the defense suggested was being used to make Betty's actions appear more immoral. The prosecution objected, and Fitzpatrick was excused after his testimony. Next, the prosecution presented testimony from the security guards at the park where Betty had allegedly met James. A park guard confirmed that James White had arrived at the entrance and requested permission to retrieve a book from Betty Wilson. Another guard testified that he accompanied Betty to her car where she retrieved the book and asked him to deliver it to James at the gate. Numerous witnesses reported seeing James in the neighborhood in the days leading up to the murder. Additionally, records showed that James had checked into a hotel on May 21, 1992, the day before Jack's murder. Phone records demonstrated frequent contact between James and Betty in the weeks before the murder. The prosecution argued that these interactions, combined with the evidence found in James's truck, pointed to a clear conspiracy between Betty and James. Betty's defense team argued that her interactions with James were purely innocent and that she had been trying to help him with his addiction to alcohol and drugs. They claimed the money given to James was meant to assist him in attending an AA meeting at the park and to reserve a room, not to pay for Jack's murder. After hearing all the evidence and testimonies, the jury deliberated for 2 days before returning with a verdict. They found Betty Wilson guilty of capital murder. The jury concluded that Betty had hired James White to kill her husband, Jack Wilson, in exchange for financial gain from his estate. Betty was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. 6 months later, Peggy went on trial. A new jury was selected, and Peggy had the advantage of having a new forensic analyst testify on her behalf. James returned to the stand during Peggy's trial, but his confession was now vague and inconsistent, with key details changed, such as the time Betty allegedly picked him up after the murder. The prosecution presented the same evidence and witnesses in Peggy's trial as they had in Betty's. The major difference in Peggy's case, however, was her character. Unlike her sister, no one had anything negative to say about the beloved first-grade teacher. Peggy was portrayed as a devoted wife and mother and a dedicated member of the church, always willing to help those in need. The forensic analyst's testimony was crucial in undermining James's confession and the state's theory of the murder. He argued that James's claim of acting alone was false, suggesting that it would have taken two people to carry out the attack and move Jack's body. He also pointed out that Jack had likely been attacked elsewhere and moved to the hallway, as there were no blood splatters in the original crime scene. He also highlighted that James had not identified the baseball bat as the murder weapon. According to him, fibers from Jack's hair should have been found on the bat if it had been used to strike him, but none were present. Instead, he theorized that a fireplace poker was likely used, given the type of puncture wound found on Jack's shoulder, and that the weapon had been removed from the crime scene. Peggy's defense team argued that she had no motive to conspire to kill her brother-in-law and lacked any malicious tendencies, a fact supported by numerous testimonies praising her character and her role in the church and community. After just 2 hours of deliberation, the jury found Peggy not guilty of all charges. Peggy was acquitted, and the case against her was closed. Life in Huntsville began to return to normal after the sensational murder-for-hire case. But the story didn't end there. In 1994, 1 year after the trials, James White recanted his confession. He claimed that he had been pressured by investigators to testify against Betty Wilson and Peggy in exchange for a lesser charge. In his new statement, White expressed a desire to right the wrong he had done to Betty. He also mentioned that he suffered from blackouts and couldn't remember the events leading up to or during Jack Wilson's murder. Prosecutors warned James that retracting his confession could result in him facing the death penalty. During a second appeal for Betty Wilson, James White invoked his Fifth Amendment right, refusing to answer questions about his prior statements. Over the years, James's story continued to change. He was denied parole in both 2004 and 2020 and remains incarcerated. After her acquittal, Peggy returned to her teaching job and gave numerous interviews over the years, where she continued to assert Betty's innocence. Betty Wilson has exhausted all her appeals, with the court remaining firm in its conviction that she was responsible for conspiring to hire a hitman to kill her husband, Jack Wilson. Despite James White's ever-changing story, the court believes his initial confession during Betty's trial was credible and provided key evidence leading to her conviction. In 2006, while incarcerated, Betty remarried former Marine Robert Campbell, who had become fascinated by her case after watching an episode of 48 Hours about it. However, Alabama law does not permit conjugal visits. Thanks for tuning in to Unreal True Crime. If you're intrigued by mysteries from around the world, check out our new channel, Latin Crimes, where we dive into the gripping true crime stories of Latin America. Don't miss out. Subscribe now for more thrilling investigations.